Welcome to COVID Unmasked. I am Julia Jordan Zachery. I want to offer a little bit of a trigger warning. Listener discretion is advised. Some episodes may touch on troubling topics such as self-harm, including cutting. We talk about loss and death, might be hints of sadness. So I encourage you all to do what you need to do in order to take care of your spirit as you engage with us in Black women's journeys through COVID-19. When Black women show up, we bring our wisdom, resilience, and more importantly, we bring our truth.
She wasn't personified just into one woman. She seemed all too familiar to me, almost as if she was family.
Grab your tea. Welcome to COVID Unmasked. Today, we have a special guest, and we are focusing on intergenerational conversations on COVID-19. As is my norm, I allow my guests to introduce themselves. So now I'm going to turn it over to today's guest.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here. My name is Makeen Zachery, daughter of our wonderful host, Julia Jordan Zachery.
It is so good to be across from you again. The last time we did this, we wrote that chapter.
I know.
That's now in Black Girl Magic that so many people are always curious about. So it's really good to kind of sit across from you. And like I tell everybody, imagine we're at the kitchen table sipping some tea, just having a conversation around the impact of COVID-19. And I really wanted an opportunity to have a conversation with somebody of your generation and how you experience COVID-19. Now, of course, we have questions, but we let the conversation go wherever it wants to go, right? So we are not wedded to the questions. So let's start. What were some of the biggest challenges you faced during the pandemic?
Well, for context, I'm 24, about to turn 25 years old. And so when COVID started, I was in my sophomore year of college, and that was 2020. So I just turned 20 years old. And I don't know, it was a crazy time. I had planned that year to study abroad in my second semester, or rather, no, not my second semester, but the following year. So all of that sort of went out the window when we started hearing about this virus coming. And I remember the day on campus when it was announced. At first, we didn't know how serious it was. Donald Trump had been dismissing it as this China virus. Not that we believed him, but we didn't know that it would be something that would take over our lives in the way that it did. And they announced that school would be closed as we were prepping for our midterm exams, and that midterm exams would be postponed or canceled. So the next day on campus is great. I remember everyone being outside. There were like beach balls. It felt like one of those college scenes, in a movie. And then they were like, okay, you guys actually have to move out. And that's when it got scary. So I think to answer your question, some of the biggest challenges were just accepting that some of the things that I had planned or imagined for myself and what college would look like would be a lot different. And that instead of studying abroad in Europe or something or at Spelman, I would be studying abroad in Springfield, Massachusetts at my dad's house. And so being isolated from a lot of my friends and like the world that I was starting to build in college physically was hard. So I think that was probably the biggest challenge. In addition to of course, the fears of like the health and livelihood of people I know and love that are sometimes my elders, sometimes my relatives, sometimes my immunocompromised friends, and of course myself.
Right. I know you were pretty strict about following protocols. You want to talk a little bit about that and what that meant for you and why you were so strict about that?
Yeah, I just didn't want I was in Springfield, and so I had my father, my cousins who were my age, and my grandma, and aunts and uncles. I didn't want to get nobody else sick, one. And then two, I didn't want to get sick. It's killing people, this thing. And I didn't know I had had a virus myself, as you know, in high school that almost took me out. And I didn't want to get taken out again. And I didn't know if that made me immunocompromised. I didn't know if that meant that I just didn't know what we didn't know. At that point, there were no vaccines, and there were this talks about it being lingering and not just a cold. And I didn't know who it was affecting the most. I just didn't want to find out the hard way. So it felt like a no-brainer to me to wear masks and be vigilant about hand sanitizer and whatnot, at least for those first 2 years almost.
All right. So it's interesting because for your generation, this is probably the biggest thing you all have ever faced, right?
Yeah.
When you think about it, I mean, even for my generation, it was probably the biggest life altering thing I'd faced. And, of course, there was HIV and AIDS, but not this doesn't map on like HIV and AIDS. And I lived through the crack pandemic, but also that wasn't the same thing, right? Because some of those things you could avoid through behavior, but COVID-19 felt like, what could I do?
Right.
Except kind of sort of stay in the house. And
And it was
so,
tough because there were a lot of people my age that would, the one thing that they would tell themselves was that young people aren't affected in the same way as elders might be. But for me, it was just like, okay, we don't live in a separate world from them. And also, I know a lot of people who are our age who would not be able to survive this thing for whatever reason, or perhaps wouldn't be able to. And so that alone enough was for me was like, let me not play with this and find out what the effects of it might be. And let me get used to being a homebody for a while against my other desires. So I have no regrets about that.
what do you think you had to sacrifice the most? What was the biggest sacrifice for you?
Probably my social life to an extent, but it wasn't a sacrifice. It was just more of a reimagining of what that looked like. I think it was that and the college experience I had imagined for myself. It was, being in class with people and being able to go to clubs and, going to parties or traveling to other college campuses to see my friends, or I don't know, I didn't go to homecoming or have any of those types of experiences in the way that I would have hoped to in college, or not as much. Thankfully, I had the beginning and the tail end. But I think it also was, deepening my relationships with my friends. Of course, we kept in touch and we would FaceTime and video chat or whatever, but it wasn't the same. So, some of those I was able to sort of reignite when I went back to school as a senior after I left as a sophomore. But it felt like missed time, or time that we weren't able to really make up for exactly. So I think those were some of the biggest sacrifices. And traveling, being, I mean, not that I had tons of money as a college student, but like I would have loved to use that time to explore rather than be in one place. So I think those were maybe some of the sacrifices that I had to make.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about family. How, if at all, did the pandemic bring you closer to family members?
Well, I found myself in my hometown, Springfield, Massachusetts, for the first time since I was 3 years old, full time. And so that was cool. In some ways, it became cool in that I probably wouldn't have lived with my father again in my life. So that was really nice to have that time together. And I mean, my grandma was strict, as she should have been, but even to just sit with her and like sit 6 feet apart with our masks and pick her brain about different things, I wouldn't have had that level of access to her. And same for my cousins who I've always been close with, but I've never lived in the same town as really for most of my life. So being able to just be 5 minutes down the street from each other was always really nice. And that we had each other as friends to go through this thing. I don't know what COVID would have looked like without them because, I don't have siblings. And I wasn't near anybody else my age that I knew. And I wasn't like trying to be super social either with everything that was going on. So being around people that you knew were taking it seriously as well, but that you loved, it's something that I appreciated. And same for my relationship with, I think I might have said this, but with my father too. We had to establish a new routine. Neither of us were expecting that. Like me, I had to buy a desk for my baby room that I hadn't lived in permanently since I was a toddler. It was just a process of cohabitation that was crazy at times, but mostly fun and special.
You act like you didn't live with your daddy for all your life.
Well, no, of course, but like I hadn't lived with him since sophomore year of high school.
Okay.
So that's like 5 years. Yeah.
Okay, Miss Thang. I'm like, girl,
It's
but
different.
this is your story.
Yeah.
So I'm going to act like I don't know what the story is, but I'm listening to you. I'm like, wait, what?
I think that makes sense.
I'm gonna let you tell it. I'm gonna let you tell
Mhm.
it. Okay. But I know that it was hard for me because we thought that you were just going to be in Massachusetts for a short while and then go back to college, and then they were like, nah, come get your stuff, y'all not coming back. And I was like, oh my god, my baby, I have not been apart from my child for so long. It was hard. It was
Mhm.
hard. And then also to be apart from my mother for that long, because I had not
Mhm.
gone that long without ever spending some sort of time with my mom. So,
Yeah.
we all had to make these adjustments. I'm teasing you, but it was this really interesting moment for me across generations when you all would talk about your gardening and that kind of intergenerational kind of bonding, for lack of a better term, that occurred. You want to talk a little bit about gardening, not just down the street with Grandma Abdullah, but also across the Atlantic Ocean with Grandma Monica. You want to talk a little bit
Yeah,
about that? Mhm.
totally. I think in lieu of the sacrifices that we talked about that I quote unquote had to make, I think there were other things that, in terms of like hobbies and ways of spending my time, that I discovered too because of that period of
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
And one of those things was gardening. And I don't know how
Mhm.
that came to be. I forget what motivated it exactly, but I know the weather was warming up and I was like, okay, well, I'm not moving back to New York yet. So what am I going to do? We have a backyard. Well, let me make something shake. So I watched a bunch of YouTube tutorials. And then I also told Grandma Monica in Barbados what I was planning to do. And she, of course, gave me all the advice about how to make a raised bed and what type of seeds to plant in the ground versus seedlings to put in like little containers or whatever you call those things. I
To
forget what they're called.
transplant.
Yeah,
To
exactly.
transplant. Mhm.
And she would send me pictures of her garden, and I would FaceTime her and to ask her questions about mine if something wasn't bearing. Or I remember she's who told me, actually, I think about zucchini when you grow them, there's the female flowers and the male flowers. And how if you don't have enough veggies growing, you can
Mhm.
manually
Mhm.
fertilize. I was
Mhm.
like, whoa,
Pollinate. You can pollinate.
crazy. But I
You can
learned about
pollinate.
pollinating. I learned
Uh-huh.
about transplanting. Learned about, it was just fun. It was a way to also help the time passing
Mhm.
to see
Mhm.
things grow. It was just help.
Mhm.
It was just a nice marker in time. And I think otherwise summer might have felt a lot slower in that I was
Mhm.
bored a lot of the time, but this
Mhm.
gave me
Mhm.
something to talk about with my grandmother that was far away, again, who we hadn't seen for a while.
Mhm.
And eventually I bullied my other grandma into gardening. I
I'm
never
glad
thought,
you said bullied.
yeah. She did not want to do it, but she loved it. And she had the biggest tomato plant ever and these biggest green beans. She's not very grandma-like in that she doesn't love vegetables, unlike my other grandma. So it took a lot of convincing, and we only grew like 3 veggies and a couple herbs in her backyard, but it was something outdoorsy for us to do. I sent pictures of her to Grandma Monica in Barbados, and Grandma Monica sent me pictures of her garden. So it was just a nice little thing that I did 2 summers in a row. And then when I moved back to New York, I like really found a way to keep that going as well, so that it wasn't only a COVID hobby, but something that I was able to sustain.
Yeah, I know your grandmothers were so proud and appreciative of having that time with you to bond over something such as growing vegetables, growing
Mhm.
tomatoes. So I would know whenever you had something going on in your garden because my mother would WhatsApp me, look at Makeen. And I'm like, yes, mother, I saw it. So it was this really interesting triangle that
Mhm.
happened over gardening, right? And then it allowed us to also think about your grandfathers who were deceased, but who loved playing in the earth and growing stuff. And so,
Mhm.
your dad and I used to make fun and be like, oh man, Grandpa Abdullah and Grandpa Evan must be smiling now because look, she out here growing. So it was really, really fascinating to watch that kind of intergenerational relationship emerge differently because it was already there, but
Right.
how gardening as a metaphor, how y'all tended
Mhm.
it through these gardens to let it just bear fruit.
And you were
Yeah.
part of it too. I'm talking to you, so I think I left you out of it, but you had your own perspective on drying herbs when you weren't using them, and your little crazy watermelons that grew.
Do not talk about my watermelons.
But you tried it. Can't
I
be
did
mad at
try.
you.
Well, I did grow potatoes. I did have sweet
You grew
potatoes
many
one
things.
year.
I just happen to remember those watermelons.
All right, you go on and throw shade. All right, all right, love. So tell me, how did you care for yourself during this time? Did you develop any like routines? Did you develop any passion projects that you started during COVID? You had your garden, you had your cousins, you had poor Chip. Oh, poor Chip that used to walk
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to
endlessly.
say. That's probably the only routine I developed, going on walks. That was
Mhm,
the only motion I was really getting in my day deliberately.
mhm,
And
mhm,
yeah, we had a dog who I hadn't lived with since high school either. So that was
mhm,
nice to be back in the same house as him. But yeah, I walked Chip like 3 miles every
mhm,
day until he was panting. And we didn't have
mhm,
those little like I didn't know those doggy water bottles existed. So he just suffered until we got back home.
mhm,
And he enjoyed it. I think in some ways, I think I fell out of routine a lot in COVID. Just I didn't really
mhm,
have like I had my remote classes, and then my internship thankfully went remote. So I kept busy in those ways. But
mhm,
outside of those times, I guess I mean my routine was doing work/school, going to hang out with my cousins, walking the dog, going to bed, just doing that for like 2 years.
What a loop,
But
huh?
I know it didn't feel that long in practice, but that was the routine that came out of it. But I think in terms of passion projects, I think that was something else that flourished during that time for me in
Mhm,
ways of like trying to, because, we were dealing with both COVID and also everything else that went on in 2020. And I didn't feel comfortable, or I wasn't really in a city where a lot of protests were going on in Springfield. Like there wasn't all of that much organizing going on that I was aware
mhm,
of.
mhm,
And also, I was hyper conscious of exposing anybody, specifically my grandma, who I had in-person access to COVID. But I knew I wanted to be involved in the conversations and the sort of organizing that was going on. And so I think it was in 2020, probably in the summer, when I
mhm,
called some of my friends from college and I put together a mutual aid fund called the For Women Fund. And that was the result of just like a couple of friends who felt similarly of like, hey, I live with my mom now. She's immunocompromised. I don't really want to be in the streets, but we're all like 8+ hour drives away from each other. What can we do? And the idea that we came up with was to just raise money for Black women in need and redistribute it basically without question. So to have
mhm,
people tell us that, describe to us in very little detail without sort of subjecting them to sort of reliving any trauma, but to tell us sort
mhm,
of what type of hardships they were facing, whether it was they had children to provide for, or they were experiencing houselessness or joblessness. And then we would provide micro grants to those that applied of money that we were donated. And I think we were able to raise $25,000 in like
mhm,
just a
mhm.
couple weeks, actually, which is crazy, just using Twitter and Instagram. So I
Right.
think that was that was certainly not, I mean, I don't know, maybe there's an element to which that was self-care, but I think it was just something that I felt obligated to do. And I had to figure out how to use the digital tools that were at my disposal. And so that was one thing that I kept busy with. And then I also started my podcast, Black Girl Blueprint, in COVID too, that same year with
Mhm,
another friend from college, where we just sat on Zoom and chatted about
mhm,
pop culture topics and other things, especially navigating COVID and being a remote student and everything politically that was going on, the election and so on. It was a big year. And so there was much to
mhm,
discuss. So I think those were two, maybe not, perhaps they were forms of self-care, but also just coming up with new ways to be connected to my community in this weird,
mhm.
uncertain time.
Okay. So tell our listeners what's the name of the podcast?
Oh, the podcast is called Black Girl Blueprint. It's for Gen Z Black girls. We post episodes when we feel like it these days, but it's really still about like the experience of being a 20 something Black girl. We talk about jobs and job hunting. We talk about mentorship and our creative selves and sort of discovery of passions and things like that. We also talk about Beyonce and Chloe and Halle and all of the other musicians that we love too.
So it's like an all-round thing. But I'm curious about Gen Z Black young women. How do you
Mhm.
see COVID and the kind of racial unrest you all face as influencing your political engagement. Did you find like your peers became more politically engaged, disengaged? How was that? Like the politics
Mm,
of COVID and the politics of living through Breonna Taylor and all the other murders, George Floyd. What was
yeah.
that like for your age group?
It was a lot. I think I was, what's his, Trayvon Martin happened in 2012,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
So
Because
I was
yeah.
12 years old and I remember it vividly. I think the other context that matters a lot is that I'm someone who spent a lot of time in white schools. So a lot of my
Mhm,
peers, my Black female peers, were from similar environments and maybe had been more vocal about being Black and maybe sort of were just coming into that identity as college students was part of it too.
mhm,
But everyone I knew was vocal and I think felt a need to be in some way, primarily through social media. Some people,
mhm,
through protests, some people through other forms of like mutual aid organizing, like I was. But I remember it like that wave of infographics and the sort of like social obligation of posting something to say where you stand on these topics. And also white people, which I won't spend too much time talking about, but those responses were interesting too. It was a pressure even on them to speak up. So I feel like in general, that time of my age group, it was like, even if you're not a political person, this is something you have to have a perspective on. And
mhm,
often the result was a lot of performative behavior of posting a black square or changing your profile picture to black in solidarity, which
mhm, mhm.
I think we all can reflect on that and be like, why did that happen? And what was that
Right,
actually
right.
saying? But I
Mhm,
think, I mean, interestingly, I feel like a lot of Black women I know were involved, and a lot of Black women in that time period created digital platforms of their own
mhm,
to sort of or communed around digital platforms as both, I think, an outlet and also a place to organize. But I feel like I've definitely seen that turned down in the past couple of years since quote
mm,
unquote COVID is ended. Obviously, it's not ended.
mhm. Right, right.
But since we've gone back to normal in the past 2 years or so, I feel
Mhm,
as though like some of the people that were really vocal before, including myself, are just a
mhm,
lot quieter now in that I think they're exhausted. I think there is a
mm,
feeling of just like, I don't need these infographics. I don't need the responsibility of educating people anymore. And the work
mhm,
shouldn't fall on Black women. Not that they're not still doing it. I know plenty of people
mhm,
that are still organizing for a bunch of different things, but
mhm,
I don't see as many of those infographics, period. And of course, the topic has blown down a little bit and people have
mhm.
stopped talking as much about supporting Black-owned businesses and all of those things.
Right,
But
right.
I do think there is a level of fatigue that has contributed to that. Or just like, I don't know if it's hopelessness. I don't know if it's just like, let me just live my life and focus on me. I don't know if it's the fact that now people my age are big girls and have jobs and whatnot to
Mhm.
focus on.
Right.
um,
Big girls.
I said with quotes, but I don't know what it is, but I do feel like I've seen a little bit of a shift,
That
but it
is
was a lot.
interesting. There's a lot that you all lived
Mhm.
through. It's a lot that you all kind of sort of came of age through, and nobody can take that away. I want to shift a little bit. If you could say something to mothers and granddaughters and grandmothers, 20 years from now, somebody's going to listen to this podcast and not have gone through COVID. What is one thing you would want them to know?
I guess what I'm inclined to say is spend all of the time that you can with each other and
Mhm,
pick all of the brains you can pick in the present
mhm,
while you can. I guess that's all I could say. And I guess maybe what COVID taught a lot of us, which we still use, like we're using it right now. Zoom was never an application we had used before COVID had hit. But I think that even when there's physical distance, there are ways to form connections and deepen connections with
mhm,
people you love, be it through a WhatsApp chat and FaceTimes or whatever you so choose. But I think it was really important for me to spend the time conversing with my grandmas as
mhm.
now a young adult, a true young adult, emphasis on both words. But I think it was nice to hear their stories and the things that they've been through and see those old photos when they stumbled upon them going through whatever space. But I think it was both the forcing of us to spend extra time in our homes And also the sort of free time that we had, and that we weren't able to fill our time with these other social things that we used to, that forced us to think a bit more deeply about like, well, what do we got to talk about? And what do we have around us to explore that we haven't, be it the earth and plants, or be it, you know, this old photo album that's been in this cabinet for 20 years or something else. But I think that's what I would say, if you haven't already, to take advantage of all of that time, because it was scary. You don't know who's going to get it and who's going to make it through and not. And so you have to sort of, you know, pray that it's not going to hit anyone you love, but assume that it might. And so now what do you do? I mean, I have two questions maybe for you, and they both revolve around fears, because I think you mentioned you were afraid of just like what's going to happen. So I wonder what your fears for yourself were through COVID, and then also what your fears for me were as my mother.
I should never have asked you that. You always come with the questions, right? It reminds me of sitting down writing that chapter with you. Except this time you're not humming a song.
I know, I've resisted the urges.
You resist the urge, you child, you gotta hum along. I think my fear for me was I would never get to see you again. That I would die here without getting to snuggle up with you one more time or share a silly video, as you know, as is our norm. Now we just do it virtually, but you know, you had this thing where you still come into bed and share a silly video and a laugh. And you know, I just kept thinking, oh my gosh, what if I die and I never have that chance? Will my child remember how much I love her?
Of course.
Yeah, that was yeah. You know, my fear for you, especially having almost lost you before and having lived through that, was selfishly, you know, I thought I would give my life for my child. And if anybody was to get COVID, me, your grandmas, anybody, my grandmother, your great grandmother, I was like, Lord, let it be me. Don't let it be them, because I want you to have a full life, right? I want you to experience all the joys, the heartaches, the stuff in between of life. Of course, I don't want you to be harmed, but heartaches come with living and you bounce back, you know? But my fear was that my child was going to get this and I couldn't get to her on time, you know? And I'm like, I didn't want you selfishly to be robbed of life. So I would literally pray that if anybody was going to get it and not make it, it would be me, so that you could live. Because I knew you
I'm
had
glad your prayers wasn't answered.
I know, but I knew that you had your grandmothers. I knew you had your daddy. I knew you had all this love and would be cared for. So I just wanted you to have the fullest life possible, right? Like the fullest life possible. I was like, yeah, we can, you know, yeah, she didn't get to do study abroad. We'll figure that out. You know, me and your daddy will pay for you to go study abroad, study quote unquote abroad somewhere. But we couldn't do that if you didn't have life.
Yeah.
You know, and honestly, as a mother, and to this day, I would sacrifice my life if it meant that you have life.
Oh my goodness.
But
Well, thankfully we're speaking hypothetically.
yes. Yeah, and I still worry. I'm not gonna tell a tale. You know, I am I still, you know, I'm not paranoid about it, but I still worry. You know, every now and then I'm like, oh, I haven't heard her yet for today. And then you try to back up and not be an intrusive mother and you wait. And like, oh, okay, she's fine. And no, I don't check your location or anything. I just let you check in, you know? But yeah, that was my fear for you, that you wouldn't get to blossom into all of the fullness that have been poured into you. Because you still have a lot of ways to go, as you used to say, to spill it over.
Well, that was very, I don't know. What is the adjective for being a martyr or a hypothetical martyr?
I don't know.
It's very martyrous of you.
Whatever. Girl, bye. Shoot, when you almost lost a child and you live with that, it changes. It changes things. It really does change things.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we have come to the end. Thank you so much for your time. It's always good to talk with you.
Of course, honey. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for listening. I hope this has not felt like an inside joke conversation and something that you can take something away from not knowing either of us.
Yes. All right, be well. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you for engaging in this conversation. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on all you have heard and to think of your story. For more stories, resources, to contribute, and for updates on the larger Black Women Talk COVID project, I invite you to visit the website blackwomentalkcovid.com. That's blackwomentalkcovid.com. Remember to take care of your spirit. Until we meet again.